All right, today we're going to be looking at a background of Lehi's vision. So before we get into the nitty-gritty verses of 1 Nephi chapter 8, we need to understand more of the context of the time period and beliefs of these people. So first of all, we need to understand that these people, prior to 650 BC, the Israelites believed in a council of gods. In fact, much further back than 650 BC, all the way back to the time of the patriarchs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There was a doctrine of the council of gods. The Heavenly Father was known as El, Heavenly Mother was known as Asherah, and their oldest son was known as Jehovah or Yahweh.
The cultural and religious distance between Canaanites and Israelites was considerably smaller than Bible scholars once thought. Michael Coogan says it clearly. Israelite religion was a subset of Canaanite religion. In their attempts to better understand the beliefs of the ancient Israelites, modern scholars have been greatly helped by extra-biblical documents and artifacts that have been recovered from the soil of the Near East. For many years, there had been little beyond the Bible itself for them to study. The situation changed dramatically beginning in 1929 with the discovery of the Ugaritic texts at Ras Shamra in Syria. They revolutionized our understanding of Canaanite religion in general and of early Hebrew religion in particular. The god El was the patriarch of the Canaanite pantheon. One of his titles was El Olam. Frank Moore Cross noted, "We must understand it as meaning originally El, Lord of Eternity, or perhaps more appropriately, El, the Ancient One. The myths recorded on the tablets at Ugarit portray El as a graybeard, father of the gods and father of man. However, observed Professor Cross, no later than the 14th century BC in North Syria, the cult of El was declining, making room for the virile young god Baal-Hadu, the Baal of the Old Testament. El was probably also the original god of Israel. In the earliest Israelite conception, Father El had a divine son named Jehovah or Yahweh. Gradually, however, the Israelite conception of Yahweh absorbed the functions of El, and by the 10th century or thereabouts, King Solomon's day, he had come to be identified with him. Asherah was the chief goddess of the Canaanites. She was El's wife and the mother and wet nurse of the other gods. Thus, the gods of Ugarit could be called the family of, or the sons of El, or the sons of Asherah.
That's Daniel C. Peterson. He is an amazing speaker, an amazing church historian and theologist. He has a video. You can go see this full video on YouTube. It's a great talk about this topic. He goes into more detail. But suffice it to say that the patriarchs, or the fathers of our religion, fathers of Christianity, the fathers of all Abrahamic religions, believed in a pantheon of gods, or a council of gods that included a father, a mother, and at least one son with multiple other children. This was the Ugaritic text that he referenced. It was found in 1924, dates back to before 1200 BC, refers to El, El, the consort of El, or Asherah, and their son at least 12 times. Now, this was a doctrine that was taught and later in Joseph Smith's life, but the resource material that we have now to verify those things are true was not even found yet. Something interesting just to note. So God had a wife named Asherah. Let's get into that a little bit. That's something that we might not be as familiar with. The Book of Kings suggests that she was worshipped alongside Yahweh in his temple in Israel. According to an Oxford scholar in 1967, Raphael Patai was the first historian to mention that ancient Israelites worshipped both Yahweh and Asherah. So this was the consort. This was the family, the heavenly family, the council of gods with El and Asherah making up Elohim. If you've heard the word Elohim, it's actually a plural word describing El and Asherah together as the gods. And Jehovah, their son, and Baal, and as much as 68 others who are the leaders of the 70 nations, with Jehovah being the leader of the Israelite nation. So, history of Heavenly Mother. We need to understand this before we understand the vision of Lehi. She was the tree goddess. She was the consort of El, who eventually got absorbed into the same role and function as Yahweh. And so many of the later archaeological finds will call Asherah the consort of Yahweh, or they'll say Jehovah and his Asherah, because Jehovah and El had become one and the same. It was represented with a tree inside the Holy of Holies within the temple. So this is very important as well. Inside the temple, the original first temple built by King David. Not only was there a throne for God within the Holy of Holies, but there was also a statue of Asherah, Heavenly Mother, inside the Holy of Holies. It was represented with a tree, a carved tree. There were many holy trees throughout Jerusalem that were worshipped as Asherah trees, including in the Garden of Gethsemane. People would decorate these trees, put candles on these trees, put gifts under these trees in a way to show respect to Heavenly Mother. She was known as the goddess of fertility. Many times in the Old Testament we'll see references to situations in which there were fertility problems, and Asherah was called on for relief and help. In fact, so much so that when Asher was born, they named their son Asher after Asherah because of the blessings they believed that Asherah had brought to them. The literal translation in English of Asherah is sacred place or grove. Now that's going to become a factor as we get into this, so make sure that you remember that. Root words in Hebrew are the same as happy and wisdom, which are also going to be very important as we dig into this vision. So prime evidence for the worship of Asherah includes an 8th century iconography and inscriptions at Krebet el-Kom. In the latter, which was Kantelet Azurad, a storage jar shows 3 boved anthropomorphic figures and several inscriptions that refer to Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, Yahweh of Taman and his Asherah, and on the back side of this inscription is actually a drawing of the tree of life. Now, keep in mind all these symbolisms. So she's worshipped as a tree, she's known as the goddess of fertility, and she's associated now with the tree of life. So what happened to Asherah? Why don't we talk about Asherah? Why don't we read more prevalently of Asherah in the Old Testament or the New Testament, or the Book of Mormon for that matter? So as we mentioned before, Israelite religion eventually combined the roles of El and Yeshua into one chief god. This had already happened by the time Josiah came along and the Deuteristic reforms started to happen. So if you remember Josiah, he was an 8-year-old king. Eventually Hilkiah the high priest told Shaphan the scribe, I found a book of the law in the house of the Lord. He found this book inside the temple, what we know now as much of the book of Deuteronomy. And Hilkiah said to give to Shaphan to read it and then give it to Josiah. So Shaphan reads it, gives it to Josiah. The things that are talked about inside this book of the law include there should only be one God that is worshipped. It includes other things like you can only have one temple, and the only altar that can have sacrifices offered is Hilkiah's, which is interesting to note because Hilkiah is the one that found the book. But Josiah sees this. There's obviously some turmoil within Jerusalem as King Nebuchadnezzar is taxing the people of Jerusalem like crazy. Their economy is falling apart a little bit. And Josiah decides, well, this must be why things aren't going well. We're worshiping wrong. We need to worship according to this book of the law. So he decides that he's going to reform the whole church, reform the beliefs of the church. And Margaret Barker, who is a Methodist and a theologian, non-LDS, really has done more research on this topic than anyone in the world and has unbelievable things to say about how this Reformation took place.
The scribes who collected and transmitted the Hebrew texts that eventually became the Old Testament made several alterations to the text to remove any reference to her. They called this straightening or putting right the text, and the changes that they made are called the tikkunei sopharim, the corrections of the scribes. They worked to remove anything that later generations considered blasphemous, and so many passages about the mother and her son were changed. Sometimes it was only by prescribing a new